Welcome to AgriTalk and thank you for keeping it KTN Farmers TV. On today's show, we are talking about pollinators and the role of pollinators in society. And with me today in studio is Dr. Eliud Muli, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Science and School of Pure and Applied Sciences at the Southeastern Kenya University, popularly known as SEKU, which also happened to be a public university. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the university.
My name is Eliud Muli. I'm an entomologist, and currently I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Life Sciences in the School of Pure and Applied Sciences. Mm-hmm. I'm also currently the Dean, School of Pure and Applied Sciences. I'm also a beekeeper. I have small-scale beekeeper. I have about 17 colonies. I'm also a small-scale farmer. I grow vegetables. I keep some goats and some chicken.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's for now.
Okay, nice. Now, when we talk about pollinators, tell us a little bit about this. What are these pollinators, or who are these pollinators?
Let me go a little bit back and start with pollination.
Okay.
And in very simple terms, pollination is the transfer of the male gamete to the female part of the flower. And this male gamete is what we call pollen grains. And any agent that is involved in this movement of the pollen grains from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower is a pollinator. Okay. And this movement can be from pollen, from the stamens of the same flower, or stamens of one flower to a different flower on the same plant, or movement of pollen from one flower to another flower on a different plant. Okay. And that is what we call cross-pollination. Okay.
So pollinators are agents of pollination?
Absolutely.
Or transporters of pollen?
Yes, transfers.
Okay.
Transferers of, if there's such a word, transferers of pollen.
Okay. Yes. Give us an examples of these pollinators.
I would want to classify them on like insect pollinators and non-insect pollinators. Okay. And the most common ones would be the bees. And again, bees are classified, we have different types of bees. We have the honeybees that everyone is familiar with. We have stingless bees. They are tiny bees. They look like very small flies. They've lost their sting or their stinging ability out of evolution. They have developed different defense mechanisms and lost the sting. And then we have carpenter bees. These are the ones that drill on your timber or your poles. They're huge, amazing things. And then we also have, not very common, they are called leafcutter bees and alicity bees. All these bees are pollinators. Then we have butterflies and moths. Butterflies, of course, we know they are active during the day, very beautiful. Moths will be active at night. So moths will pollinate plants that open their flowers at night. Mm-hmm. And an example is papaya. Papaya is pollinated by butterflies and moths. We also have beetles. Beetles, they are, for laymen, they are insects that have a very hard covering. We call it the elytra. They look like they are wearing a jacket. And these ones are very good pollinators of the palm oils. Then we have the wasps. Wasps are closely related to bees. They also sting, but they have a very thin abdomen. Okay. And they are good pollinators of fig trees, for example. Then we have ants. Ants are also pollinators of plants of the euphorbia family. And just to finish up on the insect pollinators, we have flies. Flies will pollinate mango and cacao or cocoa. So if we didn't have fly pollinators, we would not be enjoying our chocolates. No. And then for the non-insect pollinators, we have birds, ndege, like the hummingbird with a long, slender beak. And we also have bats. Bats, of course, bats are active at night, so they will also pollinate plants that open their flowers at night. Okay. So briefly, that's how I would classify them.
You've talked about the flies. Is it all the flies, or is there a particular fly?
Specific flies for specific plants. There are some plants that will have a foul smell or a bad smell. These ones will be pollinated by houseflies. Even mangoes, if you go to flowering mangoes, you'll find a myriad of insects pollinating. You'll get beetles, you'll get houseflies. You also get stingless bees, and you also get bees. So it's different flies for different plants.
Okay. Most of the time when we talk about pollination and pollinators, the bee always comes on top. Why is that so?
Of course, man and bees have had a very long association. And it's because, one, bees are very easy to domesticate. And of course, if they're easy to domesticate, you can easily get them in the environment, have them in your hives, and then you can move these hives from wherever you're keeping them and put them on your crop. Secondly, is the architecture of the honeybee body. Mm-hmm. The honeybee body is full of hairs, and these hairs are the ones that trap pollen grains when the bee gets into a flower. And interestingly is that when bees fly through air, they get positively charged. And then the pollen grains are negatively charged. And therefore, primary physics, unlike poles attract, so when the positively charged bee gets onto a flower, the negatively charged pollen automatically sticks in the body. And this makes the bee a very good pollinator. The other thing is that, of course, bees will be in very high populations in a colony, 40,000, 30,000, 60,000 workers, and it's the workers that go to the field. So the more workers you have, the higher the population work is done. In our primary mathematics, we used to have questions like, you have 5 men digging a certain area of land in 5 hours. If you increase the men to maybe 10, how long do they take to do the same kind of work? Same thing. So if you have a big population of workers working on bees, on plants for pollination, then you have a better job done. And that's why honeybees have that. Then the other thing is what we call flower fidelity or flower constancy. A honeybee that starts working on crop in the morning like coffee will do several trips working purely on the coffee plant. And they can work on one flower until their death. And what it means is that if a bee is moving from a coffee flower to another coffee flower, then pollination is taking place. Pollen grains are not lost. But if a bee moves from coffee to maize or to a bean, these crops are not related, different species. So pollination will not happen. So the flower constance is a very critical feature of why honeybees are immense pollinators. And lastly, a honeybee queen can lay 1,500 eggs, 2,000 eggs in a day. That means there are very many babies in a colony at a particular time. We know from, again, basic home science that proteins are bodybuilding foods. And bees get proteins from pollen. So when you have a big population of babies, then you need a big supply, big and constant supply of pollen. So the bees are deployed into the field, they're bringing in immense amounts of pollen, and in the process, pollination occurs. So in a nutshell, that's why honeybees are immense pollinators.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over the last few years, there has been concerns that we are really losing these pollinators. What could be the cause of this loss, and what can we do to reduce these losses?
True. We have had, especially in the Western world, they have domesticated that. For example, in the US, for the last couple of years, maybe 10 years, they've been losing 30% of their colonies annually. And that's a big loss, millions of colonies. And even here, we have evidence that we have lost colonies or honeybee over the period of maybe for the last 10 years, and I'll come back to why that is the case. And one of the issues is the habitat destruction. When we destroy our environments, like cutting trees indiscriminately, 3 things happen. 1, there are no food resources for the pollinators. 2, there are no breeding sites for the pollinators. 3, there's no sheltering sites for the pollinators. So every time you cut down one tree, probably you are dislodging several pollinators, several bee species, several moths and butterflies and things like that. So habitat destruction is critical. Number 2 is the indiscriminate use of pesticides. We need to, first let me say that pesticides will have likely 2 effects on any pollinator, but let me stick to the honey. They will kill the bee, that's what we call lethal effect, or they will have what we call sublethal effects. These are effects that will not kill the bee, but the bee will be negatively affected. For example, their growth and functioning will be compromised. And a good example, let me give you a good example. Bees, the worker bees carry out several functions in the hive. The very young babies, adult babies, their work is to clean the house and feed the queen and feed the young babies. And bees communicate through chemicals that we call pheromones. Therefore, and of course we know that even for human beings and other animals, your diet as a baby depends on your age. Very young babies can only take milk. As they grow older, they are went into porridge and other stuff. Bee babies, the same thing. Very young larvae will need a special type of food called royal jelly, which is constructed or manufactured in the heads of young bees. And it is poured down to them. So a bee, or a worker bee, has to learn and communicate with this larvae. And the larvae says, hello, I'm hungry, I am 2 days old, and therefore the bee interprets that and knows a 2-day-old gets this type of food, which is different from a 3 or 4 or 5 days old. So this communication or this learning is highly, highly impaired when bees are exposed to pesticides. Then number 3, of course, is the issue of parasites, pathogens, and pests. We have documented in Kenya the key pests. So the honeybee will be wax moths, there will be an invasive mite called the varroa mite, which has destroyed millions of colonies in Europe and Northern America and also some parts of South America. But luckily for us, we reported these mites in 2009, 2010. And during that time, beekeepers were complaining that they are getting very small swarms, or they are not getting bees into their hives. But we encouraged, through very rigorous discussions with the State Department of Livestock, we said we need to not introduce chemicals into our hives. Let's see how the bees fight. And out of this fighting, there's now what we call natural selection. Of course, we lost many bees. There were many casualties. But the bees that survived that initial invasion by the mites are now tolerant or resistant, and they are coexisting. So we are not worried about that. Then, of course, pests I've talked about the wax moths, and we have diseases that again are closely associated with varroa mites. We have several viruses, but I want to talk about just one for today. There's what we call the deformed wing virus. And this virus, when bees get into adulthood from the pupa, they come out with deformed wings. They just look like stings, like just pieces of a stalk of grass. So that bee cannot fly. And any worker bee that cannot fly is useless to the colony. But again, in the initial stages when we were monitoring the effect of varroa mites, we used to see a lot of bees without wings. But now you rarely see them, meaning that, again, our bees are fighting on their own, natural selection. So the other thing that is leading to pollinator declines, of course, is climate change. Prolonged droughts means there will be no flowering, there will be no food. Again, this also affects the migration patterns of the honeybees. And of course, we know for sure that flowers are flowering for a shorter period of time with climate, because of climate change and global warming. So bees have a very short period of time to either reproduce or build up their populations. And this, again, has a negative impact on our production.
Okay. Do they also get sick?
Bees get sick, yes. Like I've just said, if you eat poison, you may not die, but your health is compromised. And if there are opportunistic infections, then you get hit hard because your immunity is compromised. So again, honeybees that are exposed to pesticides, one will have a very rough time dealing with varroa mites, and will also have a very time dealing with the viruses. You'll also have a very rough time dealing with other. There's one fungal disease that we call nosema, which again is a serious bee disease in North America and Europe, but we have reported it here, but our bees seem to be surviving it without having very adverse. So yes, bees do get sick.
Okay. So what do farmers need to do to help increase the number of bees?
A couple of things. I would say one is to practice agricultural practices that are friendly to pollinators, for example. We have just listed them. And this means you do not have to really clear everything on your farm. You can leave some uncultivated strips on your farm, or you can have what we call hedgerows that are not cultivated, so that at least there's something that is flowering when crops are not flowering, so that bees have an alternative source of food. That is one. I've talked about pesticides. We need to have a clear picture that pesticides do kill bees or cause supplemental effects. And then when we are spraying, we need to know which pesticides are friendly to bees. When do we spray? For example, we don't spray during the morning when bees are very active in the field. And, linked to this, we need to have a lot of education and awareness. And I'm glad we are doing this session so that at least we get our people to understand that there's a lot of simple things that we can do. Even talking to our children, telling them every time you bite a fruit, you have to think of immense work that has been done by honeybees to produce this fruit, so that we grow up with a culture of conservation, a culture of preserving that what helps us. And I want to give you an example, if you allow me. SECU has a collaborative project with Penn State University in the US, Pennsylvania. And one time I was going to the US. And when I got to the airport on the other end, you get to the border, what do you call them?
Border control.
Border control desks. And they got my passport and checked my visa. And the guy asked me, why are you in the US? And I told them, we have this collaborative beekeeping project with the Penn State. We want to see why your bees are dying and ours are not dying in such high numbers. And he just stamped my passport and said, go save the bees. And then at the taxi end, I met an Ethiopian driver. And the East African brotherhood thing came up. And we were just chatting, and he asked me why I'm in the US. And again, I told him about saving the bees and bee research. And he was very impressed. And he said, we need to save our bees because our food production depends on it. So this is the level of awareness that we need to get to our general public. It doesn't have to be just researchers and students who know about bees. Let it go down to our farmers, whom I respect very much. They're the people who feed us. But let them get the understanding on the association of food production and pollination.
Okay.
And of course, I talked about climate change being a factor that is leading to decline in honeybee populations. So any action against climate change will go a long way in preserving our pollinators.
Okay. Earlier on, you talked about conservation agriculture. And there are these groups that practice organic agriculture, and they've been calling themselves the Friends of the Bees. Do you believe organic agriculture is a good solution towards improving or increasing the number of the bees?
Absolutely, absolutely. We even have organic beekeeping, where we encourage beekeepers not to keep their bees close to, for example, areas where there's heavy pesticide use. So organic agriculture, organic beekeeping, anything that reduces the chances of pesticides getting into our bee colonies or getting into our hive products is highly welcome. So yes, that is a good measure of preserving our pollinators.
Okay. Do you also think we have enough policies and laws that govern the use of pesticides and the protection of the bee?
I would say yes, we have. I know we have a draft national beekeeping policy. For the last 10 years, it is in a draft form. I know there are very many laws around the NEMA and the Ministry of Environment, KFS, Kenya Wildlife Service. But our problem is when we come to enforcement. That is where we have the biggest problem. And I think, without spoiling anyone's name, I would want to say that there is much more that we can do.
Okay.
Much more that we can do.
Okay. In terms of education and in terms of dissemination of information like the one you're passing into me now, how easy or how difficult is it for anyone who is looking for information about the bee and how to protect the bees is?
I would say it is very easy if you know where you are looking for this information. For example, if you want to get information about moths and butterflies, your first shop of stop should be, according to me, the National Museums of Kenya. They have been doing a lot of work on moths and butterflies. If you want information on honeybees, you can come to Seku, you can go to Egerton University, you can go to Jost, Jaramogi Oginga University. I know they have a beekeeping project. Masinde Muliro to some extent on stingless bees. Kefre is also involved in beekeeping. Calro is also involved in pollinator research. ISIPE, which is an international center based in Dodobel, Kasarani, they're also doing a lot of good work on pollination. The Directorate of Veterinary Services, they're in charge of honeybee health in Kenya. They're the ones who should be drafting the rules and regulations of how to protect our bees. Also, I know they have projects and they're doing a very good job. KU, Kenyatta University, I know they have beekeeping projects running. County governments, I know Kitui County government, Turkana County government, several of them, Marsabit, they're very good in Baringo, and actually in Baringo County is where we have the National Beekeeping Research Institute, and of course, you know, Baringo is also a very good honey production area. So if you know where you are looking, where you are looking for this information, there's a lot of information around.
Okay. There's a time I had visited Holland, and I visited some organization that they were breeding the bumblebee.
Yes.
And they were talking about how the bumblebee is the next generation of super bees.
Yes.
Maybe explain to us why the bumblebee, they were considering breeding the bumblebee instead of the honeybee. And what's the difference between the two of them?
Yes. The closest I can say is that the equivalent, our equivalent of the bumblebee is the carpenter bee. And they are, of course, we say that the honeybee is an immense pollinator, but it is not effective pollinator of several plants or several crops. So this job will be done better by other bees, especially the bumblebees. And of course, we know bees sting, bumblebees don't. And there's now a lot of shift into growing crops in enclosures like greenhouses. And then the bumblebee and the carpenter bees and the stingless bees become very critical because you can move them in enclosures where people are working without the worry of getting stung. That is one reason. The other one is now we have these problems that are facing the honeybees. I'm sure you've heard of CCD, colony collapse disorder, where we are losing millions of colonies of honeybees because of the things that we've mentioned. People are thinking of alternatives. If we lose the bee, then what is our plan B? The plan B is the bumblebee for Europe.
Okay.
Yes.
I've also seen in documentation on a lot of stories coming out of the US of what they call the invasion of the African bee in their region. And it's causing a lot of devastation. I don't understand. I've always find it hard to wrap my head into that conversation. We are living very well with our bees. Why are they complaining?
A little bit of history. The honeybee, Apis mellifera, there are a lot of theories of where they originally came from. And Asia, which has a big diversity of honeybees, is thought to be like the origin. Africa also is also thought, especially East Africa, is also thought to be the origin of the honeybees. Where I can mention that we have 5 subraces of subspecies of honeybees in Kenya. And that diversity makes some people think that our bees originated, East Africa is the cradle of the honeybee. Having said that, in Europe, the bees that they have there are not highly defensive. They do not sting because, again, because of evolution, we have a lot of enemies of the honeybee in the tropics. And therefore, natural selection has selected honeybees that can defend themselves against this wide range of natural enemies. And therefore, our bees are very prone to stinging. In Europe, they do not have many enemies of the honeybee. And therefore, the honeybees are not prone to sting. And therefore, these are bees that you can work with even without protective suit. You only need a smoker. You can play around with your bees. Now, the problem is that there's one professor from Brazil. He got some bees from Mozambique, the African bees, because our African bees are very resilient and they're very hardworking. So he said he needs to move some to Brazil and interbreed the European bees that were in South Africa, South America at that time, with the African bees and get a hybrid that has the good qualities of both sides. So what happened is now they got ours are African bees. But when they mixed the African and the European bee, they got what they call Africanized.
Africanized bee.
Africanized bee. They are not as defensive as people would say. I have worked with them through our collaboration with the Penn State University. I've worked, and to me, they were very good bees to work with. But you know, because of their history, where they are working with bees that they can work without having to suit their bodies and all that, then they think that our bees are very defensive. So that's why they think that their bees are different, but they don't. And again, it is something now. The Africanized honeybees are proving to be very resilient against the varroa mite, for example. And there's now a shift from seeing them from a negative point of view to seeing some positives in the sense that you do not have to treat them with chemicals, like you give your cows medication, and this perception is changing to a large extent.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Ari. I think we'll take a short commercial break, but we will be back shortly. For our viewers back at home, those who have joined us midway, today we are talking about pollinators.